It was March 1st, 2000 in Aberdeen, Australia. It was a normally peaceful and quiet town unfamiliar with crime, and certainly not accustomed to particularly brutal ones. But on this day, as two children were sent away to stay at a friend's house for the night, the most savage of crimes would take place. And in all of Australia, no crime before it, nor any crime after it would compare. Welcome back to Crime A to Z, where we detail cases and criminals from their very beginning, until well after other reporting ends. Today we'll be covering one of Australia's most notorious female killers. She's the only woman to be serving a life sentence without possibility of parole that has an unprecedented special instruction on her file due to how heinous her crime was. We want to warn you that this video covers graphic accounts of cannibalism, dismemberment, and other gruesome acts. If you're not comfortable with those topics, we recommend skipping this particular case and tuning into one of our other cases instead. Barbara and Jack Ruffin lived a relatively simple life in the small town of Aberdeen, Australia. During their marriage, Barbara and Jack gave birth to 4 sons. At some point after their 4th son was born, Barbara began having an affair with a co-worker of Jack's named Ken Knight. Once people around town became aware of the affair, Barbara and Ken began facing backlash and eventually decided to move away from Aberdeen to Moree. Barbara and Jack's 2 older sons remained behind with Jack, while the 2 younger ones were sent off to live with an aunt. While Barbara and Ken did not marry, they would go on to have 4 additional children together, including twin girls who were born on October 24, 1955, one of which was Katherine Mary Knight. In 1959, when Katherine was 4 years old, Jack Ruffin passed away, and the 2 older sons that were living with him came to live with Barbara, Ken, and the rest of the children. Then in 1969, the family moved back to Aberdeen. By this time, it was clear that Ken was an abusive alcoholic who would rape Barbara multiple times per day. And Barbara also played a large role in the dysfunctionality of the family dynamic. She often shared with Katherine and later future daughters the intimate details of her sex life and how she loathed both sex and men. Once Katherine became older and began engaging in intimate activities with her own partners, she complained to her mother that one of them wanted her to participate in acts that she was not comfortable with. Her mother's response was to put up with it and stop complaining. As a child, Katherine was described by some people as both loving and kind, while others, including many of her classmates from Muswellbrook High School, remember her as a loner and a bully. On one occasion, she assaulted a male classmate, and on another, a teacher injured Katherine while acting in self-defense. When Katherine was not acting out is when she was considered to be a model student and even earned awards for her good behavior. When she left school at age 15, Katherine could neither read nor write, and given that there was a meat factory or slaughterhouse in every location her family had lived, it was not surprising that she aspired to work there someday when she grew up. But the first job she landed after leaving school was as a cutter at a local clothing factory. She worked there for a year before landing what she called her dream job, which was cutting the internal organs of animals at a local slaughterhouse, alongside her father, twin sister Joy, and brother Charlie. There, she was soon promoted to a position deboning meat and was given her own set of butcher knives, which she hung over her bed so that they'd always be handy if she needed them. She claimed that she would hang these knives above her bed at every home that she would subsequently live in. In 1973, Katherine met 22-year-old David Collette, who was a co-worker at the slaughterhouse. David drank heavily, brought on by 2 traumatic events in his life. One being his best friend being killed right before his eyes, and the other being involved in the rescue attempt of children whose bus was struck by a train, 6 of whom were killed. Within a year of meeting, David and Katherine got married. The couple arrived to the wedding service on Katherine's motorcycle, with David heavily intoxicated. At the wedding, Katherine's mother gave David some advice. "You better watch this one or she'll kill you. Stir her up the wrong way or do the wrong thing and you're f***ed. Don't ever think of cheating on her. She'll kill you." And that didn't take long. On their wedding night, Katherine tried to strangle David. She would later explain that it was because he fell asleep after only having sex with her 3 times. And the violence only progressed from there. When Katherine became pregnant, she burned all of David's clothes and shoes before she hit him in the head with a frying pan. The offense that triggered the violence was that he arrived home late from a darts competition because he had made it to the finals. Worried that he was about to die, David escaped to a neighbor's home where he collapsed with a severely fractured skull. Police wanted David to press charges against Katherine, but Katherine talked David into dropping all charges. In 1976, shortly after the birth of their first child, Melissa, and fed up with the 3 years of abuse he had endured from Katherine, David left Katherine for another woman and moved to Queensland. Katherine was devastated by the departure. Her behavior became even more erratic than normal. It landed her in the hospital where she was diagnosed with postnatal depression. She spent several weeks in recovery there, and once released, she promptly packed up her newborn, took her to the train station just before the train was due to arrive, and placed the baby on the tracks. She then headed downtown with an axe, threatening to kill several people along the way. Back at the train station, a homeless gentleman rescued 2-month-old Melissa just minutes before the train would have arrived. Katherine was hospitalized again, but checked herself out the following day. Not surprisingly, there was no change in her behavior. Within a few days, Katherine slashed a woman's face with one of her beloved knives and demanded that the woman drive her to Queensland to find David. But once they reached a gas station, the woman escaped, and Katherine threatened to kill a young boy that she had since taken hostage. Police arrived, disarmed her, and had her admitted to a different psychiatric hospital. There, Katherine admitted to nurses that she had planned to kill the mechanic at the gas station since he was the one who had repaired David's car, allowing him to leave her. She said she then planned to kill David and his mother once she arrived in Queensland. When police informed David of the incident, he left his girlfriend and returned to live in Aberdeen with his mother so that he could support Katherine in her time of need. Once Katherine was released from the latest facility, she and David moved back in together to Ipswich, where Katherine landed another slaughterhouse job at Dinmore Meatworks. A few years later, they welcomed another daughter, Natasha. And 4 years after that, in 1984, Katherine left David. Katherine's next major relationship began 2 years later in 1986 when she met another David Saunders, a 38-year-old local miner. Within a few months, Katherine and her daughters would move from the government-provided housing they were living in at the time to live with Saunders. The relationship was tumultuous, with Katherine constantly suspicious of Saunders' actions, resulting in her regularly throwing him out of his own home and even cutting the throat of his 2-month-old puppy right in front of him. She told him that it was an example of what would happen to him if he ever cheated on her. Then, in another violent episode, like she had done to David Collette before him, she hit Saunders in the head with the frying pan, this time knocking him unconscious. Despite the violence and sheer brutality of the relationship, Katherine went on to have a child with Saunders, a daughter named Sarah. But there was an end in sight for the tumultuous couple. The final breaking point came after a particularly violent fight where Katherine struck Saunders in the face with a clothing iron, then stabbed him in the abdomen with scissors. He moved out and went into hiding. When he tried to return to see his daughter several months later, he learned that Katherine had lied to the police, claiming she was fearful of him, in order to get a restraining order against him. Katherine would go on to date and have one more son by another partner before meeting John Price. John Price, known as Pricey to those close to him, was a divorced father of 3 when he and Katherine met. John's 2 oldest children lived with him, while the youngest lived with their mother. Friends and family of John described him as a terrific man that was liked by everyone who knew him. John was fully aware of Katherine's violent history, but in 1995 he still allowed her to move into the 3-bedroom bungalow he owned with him and his children, who had developed a fondness for her. In 1998, Katherine and John got into a fight over his refusal to marry her. As Katherine fumed over the fight, she decided to videotape an item that he had supposedly stolen from work, then sent the video to his boss. Even though the item he had taken was an outdated medical kit that he had retrieved from the trash bin, they were still forced to fire him after 17 years of service to the company. John was furious and promptly kicked Katherine out of the house. But after a few months had passed, despite his friends pleading with him to stay as far away as he could from such a dangerous and devious woman, John took Katherine back. But he was more cautious this time and didn't allow her to move into his home. The couple continued to fight even more regularly than before, and John's friends, disgusted that he returned to such misery and danger, no longer wanted anything to do with either of them. By the end of February 2000, John had finally had enough of Katherine and her abuse. After several terrifying incidents where he was justifiably fearful that she was going to kill him, including an incident where he awoke to find her standing at the foot of his bed with what he feared was a knife behind her back, John cut the relationship off and secured a restraining order against her. It forbid her from coming near him or his children. Once that was secured, as he had done several times in the past, he let his friends and co-workers know that if he were to not come to work the next day, it would be because Katherine had murdered him. His co-workers pleaded with him to not return home. But John, fearful for his children's lives, felt that he had no choice if he were going to protect his children. When John arrived home that night, his children were not home. Apparently, Katherine had come by and sent them away to stay at a friend's house for the night. Even though Katherine was not his home either, John decided to stay away from the house as long as he could, staying at a neighbor's home for most of the evening, then returning home about 11 p.m. At some point after John had fallen asleep, Katherine arrived at his home and awoke him to have sex. John fell asleep afterward. The next morning, March 1st, a neighbor was surprised to still see John's car in his driveway since he'd usually left for work by that point. And since John was never late for work, his co-workers were also concerned when he had not arrived by a certain time. So one of them went to his home to check on him. Together, the neighbor and the concerned co-worker tried to wake John by knocking on his bedroom window. At some point during their attempts, they noticed blood on the front door and called police. Police arrived and broke down the back door to get into the home. And what they saw from that point on left the officers so traumatized that they still struggle to this day to cope with what they saw. Upon entry, police first came across John's skin hanging from a hook in the doorway arch of the lounge room. Not recognizing the dangling obstacle amidst the dim lighting and figuring it was some sort of drapery, one of the officers brushed it aside as he passed, only to have his arm covered in blood from just grazing it. Later autopsy results would show that, drawing on her years of experience butchering animals, Katherine had used medical precision to meticulously slice John's corpse, then carefully pull the skin from his flesh. From the tip of his head to the bottom of his feet, the entire body of skin, complete with all its stab wounds, was in one piece, including the hair, face, ears, nose, mouth, and genitals. The skin suit dangled from the hook with blood still dripping from it, and its intact feet dangled on the floor. The autopsy pathologists surmised that the entire process would have taken about 40 minutes, at which time Katherine would certainly have been covered in blood by the time she was finished. Police proceeded past the skin suit further into the home, where they quickly came across John's corpse lying on the floor. It was both skinless and headless. Katherine had decapitated John's corpse. She also left a blood-stained note that she had written on top of a photo of John. The note groundlessly accused John of raping Katherine's daughter and other indecipherable rantings. While Katherine's monstrous acts up until that point were difficult to fathom, it was only the beginning of her depravity. Her next actions were unthinkable. Katherine took John's skinned and decapitated head, placed it in a large pot, and boiled it, along with vegetables at some point during the morning, since it was still warm when police arrived later that morning.
They go in and there's a meal on the table, for God's sake. There's vegetables, there's gravy, there's his meat, which he's cooked in the oven. If you saw it in a horror movie, you'd almost laugh because it's just so over the top. These are the things those coppers saw that day, and these are things that never leave them.
She then proceeded to slice off parts of John's buttocks, preparing them as gruesome steaks to be served alongside an elaborate array of baked potato, vegetables, and gravy. She prepared 2 plates along with name cards for each of John's 2 children. She had fully prepared to serve John's body to his children to eat. They fortunately did not arrive home to do so. There was a 3rd meal as well, but it was found thrown in the backyard. Authorities suspected that either Katherine had attempted to eat it but could not, or she had prepared it for the dog. Police proceeded through the home to ultimately find Katherine's loudly snoring body in bed in a bedroom near the end of the home. She had swallowed a large number of pills which caused her to pass out. The dosage was not nearly enough to kill anyone though, so she survived. Once the scene was fully processed and analyzed, authorities determined that after the initial attack, John had awoken and tried to turn the light on when Katherine began chasing him through the house. He managed to make it outside at some point, but then either Katherine dragged him back inside, or he stumbled back in, at which point he collapsed and bled to death. She had stabbed John 37 times in the front and back of his body, many of which were deep enough to reach his vital organs. A detective on the scene described what he saw. He stated, "He's getting up. There's arterial spurting on the robe and the bed, and on the doorway there's a bloodied handprint or swipe on the western side of the door near the dressing table, and blood around the light switch. It looks like he's tried to turn the light switch on, and then all down the hallway they're everywhere, referring to the bloody handprints. And he's almost made it. He's opened the front door. The screen door is shut. There's blood staining. Trajectory again, flicking out across the front door. He's almost made it, but he wouldn't have survived. He would have been absolutely horrified. Terrified. Probably terrified, more than horrified, trying to get out and all the time being stabbed." After Katherine killed John, she went into town and made a $1,000 withdrawal from John's bank account. Then she returned to carry out the atrocities that police were forced to discover. After the horrendous murder of John Price became known, Katherine's former boyfriend David Collette recalled how close he came to the same fate as John. He remembered waking up one morning and find Katherine sitting across his chest, grazing his throat with a knife. At the time, she laughed and commented how easy it would have been for her to have killed him. He didn't realize at the time how fortunate he was that she had not. Once talks of charges against Katherine were underway, she attempted to negotiate a plea of manslaughter instead of murder. Her offer to plead guilty to manslaughter was rejected. She was officially charged with murder on March 2, 2001, to which she pleaded not guilty. Her trial began on October 15, 2001. Before the trial began, the presiding judge offered the 60 jury prospects the option of being excused from the trial due to the extremely graphic nature of the photographic evidence. 5 of the prospects took him up on his offer and were excused. Several more dropped out after hearing the witness list. Then the jury was officially impaneled. However, before court was adjourned that day, the judge was advised that Katherine intended to change her plea from not guilty to guilty. The judge swiftly adjourned for the day, then ordered a psychiatric assessment overnight to determine whether Katherine fully understood the consequences of changing her plea to guilty, and that she was psychologically fit to make such a decision.
I was somewhat nervous about this because I was concerned that if I took a guilty plea, sentenced her, she would then appeal to the Court of Criminal Appeal and say she was insane at the time that she made the plea of guilty. I decided that I should get a court expert to examine her. And the psychiatrist came to exactly the same conclusion as the other psychiatrist that had seen her, namely that she was not insane, she was quite sane, but she was a bad woman.
The following morning, Katherine arrived at her trial, changed her plea to guilty, and the jury was dismissed from their duty. As of the making of this video, Katherine has never given a reason for changing her plea. She has also never accepted responsibility for John's murder or her actions afterward. Next came the sentencing hearing. In a bold move by the defense, Katherine's lawyers requested that she be allowed to leave the courtroom to avoid hearing some of the particularly gruesome details of the case. The request was swiftly denied. Then later, as details of the crime scene were being described, Katherine became hysterical and had to ultimately be sedated. When it was time to hand down Katherine's sentencing, the judge did not hold back. He pointed out the extreme brutality of the crime and noted Katherine's complete lack of remorse, stating, "Katherine Mary Knight does not qualify for mercy. She showed him, referring to John, no mercy. The last minutes of his life must have been a time of abject terror for him, as they were a time of utter enjoyment for her. She has not expressed any contrition or remorse, and if released, she poses a serious threat to the security of society." He sentenced Katherine to life imprisonment, refused to set an eligible for parole period, in order that her file be designated as never to be released, which was a first to happen to any woman imprisoned in Australian history.
This was as bad a case as you got, so she had to go to jail for the term of her life. But I can tell you that I found this a very stressful matter. In fact, after it was over, I didn't eat meat for about 3 months.
Katherine Knight is currently serving her life sentence at Silverwater Correctional Complex under maximum security. Considered Australia's toughest women's prison, it's reported that violence erupts daily, and 90% of inmates are drug addicts. Because of the sheer brutality of the crime she committed, Knight commands respect from both the inmate population and even prison staff. She doesn't put up with anything from either the inmates or the guards. If her cell needs to be searched, she demands that she stay and watch. She screams at the guards, who figure it's less of a hassle to just let her stay and to physically restrain her, which is the only alternative when it comes to Katherine and her combative nature. So, while she doesn't actually have a record of violence in prison, not even a single incident, she's in charge and everyone knows it. So much so that her nickname used by the guards is the Boss. As far as Katherine's daily prison life, it starts each morning at 7 a.m. to prepare for her 4-hour shift making headphones. It's reported to be the most tedious job in the prison, involving a huge and very loud production machine. She's monitored constantly, with guards watching her every move. But despite Katherine's notorious reputation and constant monitoring, she has also built both a reputation as well as a physical space that is quite contrary to her evil side. She's known as the Nana for being a mediator to other female inmates, often interceding before conflicts escalate, discouraging thievery and generally taking on a motherly role. And for her physical space, she has turned her cell into a homey haven, accumulating an enormous amount of trinkets and memorabilia that she has created, crocheted for herself, or received from others. Since she's going to be there for the rest of her life, fellow inmates noted that she might as well make it feel like home. 5 years after her conviction, Katherine appealed her sentence, claiming that a life sentence without the possibility of parole was too severe for the killing. The response from the considering judges was, "This was an appalling crime, almost beyond contemplation in a civilized society." Her parole was denied, so as long as her sentence is stayed, Katherine Knight will remain in prison for the remainder of her life. We hope this video did justice to all the victims of Katherine's heinousness, dead or alive. Please let us know in the comments what you think about this unthinkably brutal crime and this murderer. And please don't forget to click like, subscribe, and share if you like this video. Thank you for watching.